Year, new DNC. That's the goal as the race for the Democratic National Committee leadership positions they heat up, and that's ahead of its election on February 1st. These are the folks who have thrown their hat into the ring for DNC chair. The people who will determine a path forward for the party will have seats at that table. David Hogg, who is running for DNC vice chair, told The Hill, quote, "Frankly, we need to focus on building up our young people in the party, and not in a way that is patting us on the head and just taking our votes for granted, but really giving us power in the party." David Hogg joins us now. He's the president of Leaders We Deserve and co-founder of March for Our Lives.
David, welcome, and it's good to see you, bro.
Good to see you, David.
I appreciate the fact that you're doing this. I really appreciate the fact that you are holding people to the idea of transitional leadership. It began in 20, and I think it culminates after this election in someone like you stepping up to the plate. What are you hearing in the Democratic Party from young people that gives your candidacy the energy it will need to overcome, let's be honest, some folks who are like, I don't think we need a 24-year-old vice chairman of the party. And it's not about the age, it's about what that 24-year-old is bringing to the table. And you have an opportunity to bring a very important constituency to that table. Talk about that.
Well, for one, I think that there's a real reckoning that's happening in the Democratic Party, unfortunately, because of the 20-point shift to the right of 18 to 29-year-old voters that we saw in this election. And when I was in the audience at the executive committee meeting at the DNC a few weeks ago in Washington, D.C., and their pollster was talking about why we lost the election, the first thing that they brought up was 18 to 29-year-old voters. And I looked around the room, and I basically saw nobody else that looked like me in terms of my age, under the age of 30. And we can raise all the money that we want, but that's not going to change the fact that if we don't have the types of voters in the room that we're trying to target, a lot of that money very likely is going to be mistargeted. And surprisingly, there's been a lot of good support from older people as well across the party, where there's a reckoning and an understanding that there's a need for intergenerational leadership with the wisdom of people from the past, but with the fresh ideas of people from my generation as well, and building that coalition and diversity into our party. Because right now, in terms of the age diversity of the DNC, currently less than 6% of the entire body of voting members are under the age of 36, which is insane compared to how much our party actually relies on them to build our power.
David Hogg, you talked about voters 18 to 29. I want to pull up for you what the gender split looked like in this past election. This is from NBC exit polls of the 2024 presidential. You had men 18 to 29 breaking for Donald Trump, 49%. Women, same age, breaking for Harris, 61%. Talk about young people generally. When you talk about young men, what do you need to do to make up those numbers?
I think we need to end the false dichotomy that says that we need to either focus on young men or focus on young women. Our young men are struggling around the country. There is a mental health crisis, there is an educational crisis, and there is a whole litany of other issues that we have to address, and realize that that is not to say that we don't need to care about young women. We obviously do, but it's to say that we need to care about both, because what's good for both is what's good for young men, and making sure that they're graduating at higher rates, that we're addressing their mental health, that we're doing much more to address the loneliness epidemic that young men are facing, is good for young women and vice versa. And we need to make sure that we aren't going into that false dichotomy, because I know that we were in the lead up to the election. When I talked to younger voters, or not even just younger voters, but when I was part of the National Finance Committee for Harris, and I asked in front of the committee, as one of the youngest people in that room who helped them raise several $100,000 for the campaign, what are we doing about young men? I was told by other people from the committee that I was ridiculous, that this was not something that we needed to focus on, and it was absurd to even care about that. And then unfortunately saw one of the largest shifts, mainly powered by young men to the right, in over 20 years of Democratic, in 20 years of elections history. And if we don't start to acknowledge this problem, it's only going to get worse. And it's going to get worse, not only for our party, but for people across the country, because men are going to keep going more and more to the right.
David, up until I went to work in the White House in the first year of the Biden administration, I was a DNC member. And so I'm interested in what are the conversations you've had with DNC members? Have you met with any of the caucus chairs? And have you met the threshold to officially be on the ballot? I believe it was 40 signatures needed from DNC members. Do you have those?
So yes, as of right now, I have 42 signatures that I've obtained, and I'm going to continue getting more just in case there's any changes in people being members when they signed versus when they didn't, just to be as safe as possible. But I have had many conversations with different members of the caucuses, with the Southern Caucus and others. And what I repeatedly hear that's striking from many of these conversations, frankly, is how many people feel like they're props in the DNC, that they're just a rubber stamp, that they aren't actually there to be incorporated or listened to as voting members, that they're just there sitting around in these meetings and aren't really being asked for help a lot of the time, other than every 4 years when somebody needs their vote to be elected to the DNC and, to an officer role, for example. And part of what's striking to me is how there's just a severe lack of investment in our state parties, and how we have this boom and bust cycle as a party where we have a multi-billion-dollar presidential race come up every 4 years, and we build all this infrastructure all of a sudden from nothing, practically. And we're having people go from blue states into states like Michigan, living in places like Detroit, where in neighborhoods that they don't know anything about outside of a Wikipedia page. And what we need to do, in my opinion, is take this money that we're able to raise as a party and invest it more in our state parties to build sustainable infrastructure, so that it's not just a boom and bust cycle, but every single year, every single election, no matter if it's a local election, a special election, or a federal election, that there are people there that know their communities, that are organizing for the communities and delivering and showing how Democrats are delivering for their communities. Because what's scary to me is increasingly our party is not looking like the working class. It is looking like the consulting class. It is increasingly more white. It is increasingly better educated, and it is increasingly more wealthy, which is crazy, but that's the shift that we're seeing, even though we are delivering as much as we can, given the voting that we had to deal with the filibuster, for example, for working people. But it's not just enough to do the work as a party. We need to be able to effectively communicate what we're doing and also meet people where they're at, and not just act like, as much as I love talking to you all, a lot of these young people are not necessarily watching TV, right? They're looking at their phones, they're on TikTok, they're on social media, and we cannot just write those things off and say, well, we'll just put a bunch of ads that consultants make money, a certain percentage from, into those platforms, because that might be good for consultants, but that's terrible for the party. And I'm not here just to stand and complain. I'm here to actually work and do something and put my money where my mouth is. And as somebody who's helped raise over $11 million this cycle for Democrats running predominantly for state legislatures around the country, I feel like I'm uniquely positioned as a 24-year-old with that perspective and the fundraising capability that I have to help diversify our party's funding and make sure that we're prioritizing where that funding is going at the same time, because this is not a problem that just money can solve.
David Hogg has something to say. This is why we post a clip, Sonny.
He's got plans, baby.
He got plans. All right, we'll be watching this race.
It.
David, thank you for coming on today. We appreciate it.
Good luck, Dave.